I had a rough idea of what I wanted to say before I came to Brussels. But after yesterday's series of talks, I've realized that everyone sitting in this room right now actually knows what kind of policies that should be implemented. But yesterday, I remember our friend from Guatemala, Gloria Alvarez, she's back there? Right. She actually said this as a member of the audience to another panel. She said, once you've actually implemented these policies, how do you keep it? And that is one question I would like to answer from the perspective of Hong Kong. But in order to answer that, I think I have to share also how we got there. Hong Kong, the modern Hong Kong began in 1840. After the Opium War, when Scottish drug runners against the Chinese law enforcement tried to force they tried to force the Chinese government to allow them to sell opium in China. And there was a series of wars, battles, in which what the British called the Treaty of Nanking, or what the Chinese would call the first unequal treaty, was signed. And according to legend, the two commanders on the British Army, Charles Eliot and Henry Pottinger, was instructed by London that whatever terms you get from the Qing courts of the Chinese Empire, you cannot take any land. That was the instructions. But supposedly there was miscommunications, maybe because the Suez Canal and the Suez Canal hasn't been opened yet, the telegram hasn't been invented yet. So there was miscommunication, and supposedly Charles Eliot and Henry Pottinger took Hong Kong, just signed it in perpetuality. So London was not happy because Hong Kong was extremely far away. In order to send the South China Sea Fleet, which was based in the coastal city of Plymouth, back then you had to sail down the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, down the Malacca Straits, and then up the South China Sea. So Hong Kong militarily was extremely hard to defend, and you were surrounded by hostile powers such as China. So basically London gave the instructions to Charles Eliot and Henry Pottinger, now that you've signed it, because supposedly when London wrote back, why did you take it? Charles Eliot wrote back, or Henry Pottinger wrote back, saying, do you want to give it back? So I guess the colonial office in London gave them the instructions, fine, you've taken this piece of land now, we are not going to give you any head count, nor any budget. You are on your own. So anyways, the Hong Kong's freedom came from our first governor, one of the commanders, Henry Pottinger. When he became governor, he laid out three basic governing tenets. The first one was that Hong Kong is not going to have any direct taxes. All government revenue is going to come from indirect taxes, such as land sales or licensing. Okay? The second governing tenet was that the British would respect local customs. Whatever the Chinese was doing, the British would respect. Now, you've got to understand, back then, the Chinese would engage in polygamy. They would break little girls' feet into what they call a small golden lotus. And perhaps the most barbaric of all to the British, the Chinese ate dogs. Okay? So to have this particular policy in place by Henry Pottinger would seem quite enlightened. The third rule, which I would say is the masterstroke, is that Hong Kong would become a free port in which even the enemies of the British Empire would be free to trade in Hong Kong. Now, in the perspective of the 21st century, the first rule of having no direct taxes seems extremely enlightened. Well, small government, no burden. Even privacy is guaranteed because income taxes are extremely invasive. On the question of respecting local customs, I mean, in the 21st century language, that would be called multiculturalism. In the third one, free trade, anyone can buy anything from anywhere to anyone in Hong Kong. And you would think that Henry Pottinger must be this really enlightened individual, perhaps someone like William Wilberforce in the 19th century. But you also got to remember that he was someone who had no qualms sailing up various rivers in China and firing at Chinese people, practically a butcher. So why would this hard-nosed colonialist, this imperialist, set in place these three governing tenets. Because, first of all, he knew that he had no budget to run Hong Kong. London would not give him any resources. So the easiest way, the cheapest way to raise funds from the government was through indirect taxes. If you were to have income tax, for example, you have to assemble a massive civil service to collect it. But if you were to get your revenue from land sales, all you really need is a map and 2 auctioneers, part-time auctioneers, right? On the question of respecting local customs, if you were to modify a group of individuals' behavior, you would require a massive law enforcement agency and clashes with the locals, indigenous people. So he decided if whatever you were doing is legal anyways, then you would have a much smaller police force required. In fact, the property tax, the annual lease rent that you pay to the government, in Chinese, is still called salary for the police. So the police was actually essentially there for property protection. For the third rule, which why would I call it the masterstroke, is that war against the British Empire always incurred a cost, obviously, no matter where it was. But in order to invade someone, Hong Kong had no natural resources. If you were to choose to invade Hong Kong, it would probably be a stepping stone somewhere else for you to acquire something that you couldn't have otherwise. But with free trade in place, this is probably perhaps also the founding principle of the European Union, but with free trade in place, the hawks of various countries no longer have the excuse to use the army to invade. And therefore, with one masterstroke, he basically aligned the interests of various potential enemies in the area with Hong Kong. Now, you would say that, well, that is not 1840. What about today? Well, all I can say is that by 1990, perhaps, or maybe even earlier, if you looked at the map of the British Empire, I always ask people, my interns particularly, this question. Why, especially after the Suez Canal crisis, where British, by policy, decided to withdraw from all the colonies east of the Suez Canal, why was Hong Kong still a colony? And the answer lied in the Korean War. And during the Korean War, Hong Kong was a massive smuggling base to China. My father always joked that James Bond was a fictitious character. Not only was he, not real, but his type of secret agents can't be real. And when I was a younger boy, I asked him why he thought so. And he said that if James Bond was real during the Korean War, Hong Kong would have never been able to smuggle that amount of stuff, all kinds of stuff, probably including munitions, to China. And back then, China had a blanket trade embargo by the United Nations. In fact, prior to 1972, if you search any of the documents produced by United Nations or American academia, there was no term called People's Republic of China. It was always referred to as Red China. Now, through this, of course, I suspect the British knew all along that Hong Kong was a smuggling base to China during the Korean War, right? But the reason why the British tolerated it was that they knew that it would align the interests of the People's Republic of China in protection of this colony. And in fact, I think it was the realization by the Communist Party in China that keeping Hong Kong as a British colony was geopolitical for them, politically, for political control anyways, of China, more useful than if Hong Kong was part of China. So if you were talking about how to sell free market to your people, right? I would take the example of Georgia. Georgia conveniently is between two countries that is being subjected to sanctions right now, Iran and Russia. There is a company, well, there was a bunch of individuals and companies that were being sanctioned last Friday by the Americans, and I was thinking to the Georgian friends that if you were to take Hong Kong as an example, to that degree of freedom, then perhaps the Russian aluminium company could ship its aluminium through Georgia and sell it through to the rest of the world. I mean, that is the degree of freedom that we are talking about here, right? We're flouting United Nations embargoes, for example. Okay? So because not only do you have to convince the people that the free market is good for them, you have to convince the elites. I mean, yes, you can have multi-party democracy, but the elites are always still in charge, right? Let's face it. So you have to tell them that it aligns the interests because that is good for your own livelihood. In fact, the jurisdiction that ranks number 2 on the Fraser Index, Singapore, does this extremely well. Singapore's government constantly warns its people that economic growth is vital to national security. The demography of Singapore is extremely delicate, and therefore people have to be well off, feel good. But they constantly remind them that they are always under threat, and the only way to fund sufficient national security is to have the economic well-being behind it. So that could be a way not only to try to persuade people to implement free market policies, but also to keep it, right? I understand that to suggest the idea, of say flouting the United Nations rules is a bit edgy, but Hong Kong is number 1. The feeling I got yesterday listening to various delegates is that everyone is trying to, to use a football analogy, everyone's trying to qualify for the Champions League, right? And I'm here telling you how to win the Champions League. So it's a whole different level. As for the future, I am very worried because backsliding is occurring in the last 2 decades. The backsliding I'm talking about, fundamentally, I think is caused by the fact that during the British colonial era, the British colonial administration knew very well that it had no democratic legitimacy. And therefore, if you had no democratic legitimacy, the only way for people not to rebel against you is if the government never exercises coercive power. Because if the government started exercising its coercive power, the people will rebel, right? But now with the security of being back in the bosom of the motherland, a lot of the Hong Kong officials no longer fear that. And there are various other few points that I want to touch on as to policy-wise how to implement it. The first of all is on investments. I hear a lot of delegates talking about attracting foreign investments. I think I grew up during the 1990s. I spent my teenage years in the 1990s. The first financial crisis I actually saw as current events was the Mexico tequila crisis. And I remember the first thing about the tequila crisis was that capital flight occurred not because foreign investors started to pull money out. The capital flight occurred because the middle class and the ruling elite of Mexico knew that something was up, and they were the first to pull money out. So if you were to think of how to attract investments, the person you want to attract is not multinational corporations. The person you want to attract, I'm sure every single delegate out here, especially from developing countries, have a large diaspora of their own citizens living abroad. You ask yourself, forget about trying to attract them back to your home country. Can you even attract their capital back to their home country?
2 minutes.
Right. So that would be the first thing. Just sit back and think, what would my cousin who's living in America or the UK do? Well, what do they have to face before they will start investing back in the home country? On the rule of law, Hong Kong and Singapore shared a very unique policy apparatus, which is to outsource it. Both Hong Kong and Singapore, during our fastest economic growth period, had the final Supreme Court being based in London. So if you were a foreign investor and you knew that the government would enforce whatever a foreign court would pass, then investors would immediately be much more confident in investing in your jurisdiction. But it is something that is extremely hard to do. I mean, Hong Kong is okay with outsourcing our monetary policy to the US Federal Reserves, and we were okay with, obvious because we were a colony, to outsource our rule of law to Britain. In fact, in our mini constitution, which is also called the Basic Law, just like the one in Oman, and I guess the one in Germany, our Basic Law says, well, it still is, that our Court of Final Appeal, the 5 judges sitting on it, there is a minimum amount of foreign judges sitting on it. So it's to inspire the confidence in the rule of law. But this goes right into the heart of sovereignty. I mean, if you are a nationalist, it's very hard to say, you know what, we can't be our own judges. We have to invite foreign judges to come in and sit down. So as I say, these are tactics to win the Champions League, not to qualify for it. On The one particular one that I heard yesterday that nearly made my ear bleed, which was on research and development. Hong Kong, if you look at statistics, dedicate a very small amount into research and development. And the reason is because the definition of research development in most statistical offices, right, talks about how much academia throw into it. They do a survey in companies, and how much are you spending on research and development? All I can say is that the engineering, the technology that Hong Kong people excel in is something called industrial operations engineering, which is if you are sitting in a cafe, for example, and you see the production line of the entire cup of coffee by the baristas, Hong Kong people excels in making that particular process as efficient as possible. The manager standing in the store, or maybe even the workers themselves, would say,
could you wrap up?
Sure. There are smarter ways of doing this. And therefore, forget about official data. Withdraw the state and let the people who knows best do the things that they're good at. Entrepreneurship is natural to everyone, regardless of race, creed, and gender. So that is the experience Hong Kong had. Thank you.